We will start the afternoon by a panel on economy, building a prosperous and resilient economy, a business case for climate action. And the panel will be led by Dr.Sharon Burke, who will talk about these opportunities in the green economy. And Honorable Sharon Burke is a senior advisor to New America, where she focuses on international security and a new program, Resource Security, which examines the intersection of security, prosperity, and resources. And the Honorable Burke served in the Obama administration as the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Operational Energy, a program that worked to improve the energy security of U.S. troops. Please.
Thank you very much. Well, I'm delighted to be here at this conference, and I may seem at first to be an odd choice to be a moderator for this because I've spent most of my career working for the military. And in the context of the military, if you say going green, they probably think you want to get into a land war because green inside the Pentagon means the Army and green suiters, literally. But in fact, in a lot of ways, the Department of Defense is just a very large business, a very, very large business with a $700 billion budget and 2 million employees. It consumes $20 billion worth of energy every year. So we were looking at, in terms of as a business, and one that has a public good, of course, how we go green. So I'm delighted to have a panel that's looking at the business case for this, because I have spent the last 4 or 5 years looking at it in the context of a very specific business. We have a fabulous panel. I'd like to introduce them to you, and then we're going to launch right in with some opening questions that I'm going to ask each of their panelists. And so brace yourselves. I'm going to shock you all. Let me start just on the end. Kateri Callahan is the president of the Alliance to Save Energy, which position she assumed in 2004, I believe, right? And the Alliance is a nonprofit organization based here in Washington, D.C. that for 3 decades has been promoting energy efficiency. So Kateri is a very accomplished public advocate, lobbyist, and very well known in this city. So it's great to be on a panel with her. Caroline Atkinson is the head of global public policy for Google. That is what she does now, but a few months ago, she was an advisor to the President of the United States. Now, a lot of people give the President of the United States advice and say they're advisors to the President, but she actually was directly an advisor to the President of the United States for international economics, Deputy National Security Advisor, right?
That's right, yes.
For international economics, and energy and climate change were in her portfolio. So delighted to have you here on both scores. So right next to me is, hopefully I'm going to get this right, the Right Honorable John Gummer, Lord Deben. Deben.
It's a river.
Deben. Okay. Lovely to be associated with a river, especially I'm from Los Angeles, so we like water. And you are a formidable politician in the United Kingdom. You've served in several governments and are a conservative politician, Minister of Agriculture, longest-serving Secretary of State for the Environment in the UK, so a considerable history in government. You started in business, and now you run a consultancy, among other things, including you are the, if I recall, the chairman of the Climate Committee for the UK. So a leader in many things, and I think very interesting to have a conservative politician showing that you can be a leader on climate change as we sit in the shadow of the US Capitol building. And then Greg Wetstone is the president and CEO of the American Council on Renewable Energy, which is a national nonprofit in the United States that promotes renewable energy through financing, policy, technology developments. He has a long history in this field himself, including, I believe, most recently as a vice president for a renewable energy company that was looking, including at utility scale. So Greg both represents the industry and has been a part of the industry, so we're lucky to have him here as well. With that, I would like to first turn to you, sir, and ask you a question. As I said, you started in business, went into government to the highest levels, and are back in business now. And the firm that you founded gives companies corporate responsibility advice. So if I were one of your companies, if I were representing one of your companies, and you were advising me on climate change, would you tell me that it's a corporate responsibility issue and good for my public relations, or would you tell me it's good business sense? And why would you tell me what you're going to tell me?
Well, I'd be bound to say that it was both, but it is certainly more importantly perhaps good business sense, because it's very rare in the world where you know the direction of travel. I mean, what Paris really confirmed was the direction of travel. We know this world is going to decarbonise. We know this world is going to seek to avoid climatic disaster. It'll do it slower and faster at different times. It'll be better in some places than others. It will forget for a bit, and it will be all that, but we know which direction it's going in. Now, that's a very important business statement. I mean, businessmen, all of us, all our lives have longed to know some things, because most of the decisions you make, you know a bit about something and less about something else, and you try to make the best decision you can in that wide piece of ignorance that's around. But here we do know what direction we're going in. We know also that certain things will make it faster all the time. One is that we will have more and more extreme weather events, and that will make the world more turbulent. And the more that you can defend yourself against that turbulence, the more likely your business will be to survive. We know that the cost of fossil fuels in terms of their effect on the economy and the environment will grow, and gradually that cost will be charged to you. So you know that you have to say to Mobil Exxon, you are making fantastically bad decisions. Business decisions. It's not just that you are wicked because you have not told the public the truth, but it's also you're making bad business decisions. And sensible people who want to invest in people who make good business decisions. So you invest in Statkraft, you don't disinvest necessarily, but you invest in Statkraft, which says, Statoil rather, which says, we believe that the future is going to be a non-fossil fuel future. So we're a fossil fuel company and we're organising ourselves to move in that direction. That's good business. It's also very good corporate responsibility, because in the end, businesses begin to build a reputation, and they can also destroy those reputations. I mean, where is Arthur Andersen today? Where is Kodak today? Where are the companies which fail to understand that they had to keep up either technologically or with the public's expectation of them? Public expects companies now to tell them the truth. They don't get into trouble until somebody finds out. Then they're in real trouble. So I don't think there's a distinction, frankly, between corporate social responsibility and good business. You can't have good business without good corporate social responsibility, nor is there any point in good corporate responsibility if you've got a crap business, because you're not going to be in business. And as sustainability is at the centre of both, you have to think of it through those times. So when my life is very exciting, because at one end I'm advising companies on obesity, because that's a threat to many food companies' future. And at the other end, you're advising them on what you do about climate change, because that's a threat to all companies' future. But they're not just threats. Both of them are enormous opportunities. So I suppose what the answer to your question is very simple. I want to tell people that they've got great opportunities here because they know where the world is going. They can see means whereby even now, while it's moving rather too slowly, that they can do things which will make them more profitable, which will protect them against future costs, which will ensure that they'll be able to be in the right place in the market when that market expands. That's what you have to advise companies to be, and then they have to be one step ahead of the rest. I mean, T.S. Eliot said, be one step ahead of the rest and you'll be a genius. 2 steps, watch out for the men in white coats. And there is a truth about this. I mean, in the presence of Google, if I may say so, it's very clever. I mean, Google isn't 2 steps ahead of other people. It's 1 step ahead of other people, because it knows that until it's achieved that end, it can't move people on to the next stage. And I think that's the same true when you're dealing with climate change, when you're dealing with energy efficiency and such like. You have to move people from where they are as far as they can go for that moment, and then you move them on again. And that's what happens in business, and that's what clever businesses do. And bad businesses, the ones people shouldn't invest in, are those who don't see the signs of the times. And one can list them. It's easier to list the bad businesses than the good ones.
Well, if you'll forgive me, not to put too fine a point on it and be very crass and American, I understand the risk management and wanting to get into the space before it's too late, but can you make money reducing emissions?
Oh yes, of course you can. I mean, first of all, if you are spending more money on your energy than you need to, you are wasting money. That money goes straight to the bottom line. If you save 20% of energy, that is direct improvements in your profits. And if you don't, you are cheating your shareholders of that money. And if the first purpose of management is to give a decent return for their shareholders who've invested in the company, it is a very serious criticism. And if you use too much packaging on your products, so that you waste energy and you waste resources, then you're also wasting money. So I never understand why so-called conservatives talk in this way. I mean, most of the nonsense that's spoken by so-called conservatives isn't conservative at all. Mrs. Thatcher would be appalled. I mean, she was the first...
You worked for her, so you would know.
I worked for her. I wrote her speeches. I was her chairman of her party. And Mrs. Thatcher, after all, was the first international statesman to believe in climate change because she was a scientist, and because she believed in it, she says you have to do something about it. If you know, you can't ignore. You have a responsibility. And what she'd say is that conservatism is first of all about believing the facts. If you read the nonsense spoken by people like Senator Imhoff, he doesn't believe the facts. So how can you believe anything else he says? If you can't, it's like saying I don't believe in evolution. It's very convenient, no doubt, but actually it isn't something you can go around your life doing. And any businessman who says I don't believe the facts is not a businessman in whose business one should invest. Because business is about believing the facts and seeing how best you can manipulate the situation to gain a profit. So my real concern is that I want to prosecute every conservative in the United States who uses that word and then goes on not to believe the facts because he isn't a conservative. What he is a kind of dogmatic right-wing... No, he's just dogmatic and right-wing.
So we're officially nonpartisan here, but it's hard for me not to enjoy immensely what you just said. So I would like to associate myself with the gentleman's remarks. And you've also set me up very well to turn to Caroline and to ask you, as a business, and especially as a business that is at least one step ahead, right? I wanted to ask you about both sides of this, because you are just transitioning into this. It's a perfect opportunity to ask you about both, because the White House did initiate this action plan for business on climate change that has some very big names in it: Coca-Cola, Walmart, and Google. Okay, so I would like to ask you about that initiative and what you accomplished with that, and the way in which businesses were making a commitment and what it means, and then talk to us specifically about what it means for Google. And looking at Google, I was struck that it's almost like it's a vertically integrated climate actor or vertically integrated green company, because they've taken climate change into everything from the product. So Google Street can show you climate effects, to the data centers and the fact that they're energy efficient, to the fact that you're buying renewable energy and choosing to locate in places where renewable energy is available, all the way up to your CEO, who has made pledges about climate change and Paris and other things. So all the way down from product to process to personality, Google is a climate actor that is investing in climate change. So it would be great if you could talk to us both about, from the White House's perspective, why bring businesses in, and was that working, to now that you're at a business? What does that vertical integration with climate change look like?
So thanks very much, and I'd actually also like to thank you for the great work at the Department of Defense, because we certainly knew in the White House that it was very important that government itself should be incorporating the lessons of climbing, walking the walk, as well as talking the talk. And the Defense Department was the epitome of this, with very forward-leaning actions early on, with a kind of hard-headed business sense of but also looking ahead and taking, as Lord Deben says, the science to understand which way you needed to go. So that was very good. Now, in the White House, most of my time on climate and energy was spent trying to wrangle international partners, countries from officials, and ultimately leaders, and help the president to wrangle the leaders from other countries to make commitments and to take actions for Paris, and to show, and beginning in November 2014 with the big statement between the US and China, to demonstrate that countries that were major emitters were serious about tackling this head on. And that was also, of course, important politically back here in the United States, because given the large, emissions from non-US, non-EU countries, it was not going to work in the United States to make a point that citizens here and businesses here should move on climate unless you could show that this was a genuine worldwide effort. However, a part of my time was a lot of the arguments, I think I want to go into it this way for the business case, a lot of the arguments from emerging market economies in particular were, well, you guys polluted the atmosphere ahead of us and got rich, and then you want to turn around and tell us we can't do the same. And I think it was important to understand that concern and to address it directly by taking on the notion that it's not possible to grow and to reduce carbon at the same time. And indeed, by the time leaders were meeting in the G20 last November, just before the Paris climate, there was a general agreement, and all of them around the table began to, including from Prime Minister Modi from India and Indonesian and Chinese leaders, were all beginning to say it's not about growth versus climate action. We will not get sustainable growth and long-term growth unless we address climate. And the fact that you can see some of the early effects of volatile weather, extreme weather events and everything helps to convince countries. But that was really a turning point. I think it was, and in order to make that real, it needs to be true. As you said, you need to have the facts. And actually the facts are that it makes good business sense. And we wanted to, now it takes some businesses who are willing to look a bit further ahead to make the bets, make the investments on clean energy and renewable energy and energy efficiency. And we felt that it was very important in the White House to have that piece of, so it wasn't just governments and government lawyers and diplomats agreeing on targets. It wasn't just even cities and other communities. It wasn't even just utilities. It was that businesses, and it wasn't just consumers or green activists, it was that businesses were saying, yeah, we get it. This is the way forward. We're going to need to have a profitable business that is based on more efficient use of energy and use of energy that is not polluting the atmosphere and adding to precipitating climate change. So from the White House point of view, the early commitment and the strong commitments of the business community last summer were extremely important to help to round out that picture and to bring together the growth and need for energy and all of those arguments and needs with the idea that it was very important to change the way in which the world was providing for those needs. And of course, that was also a big part of that President Hollande of France made business efforts a big part of the Paris climate talks. So then switching to Google, and as you say, I've been there less than 2 months so far, but of course I knew that Google was one of the early participants in this effort. And I would say that in part there is, it's a part of Google's values, if you like, then it is a company, as I've heard from the outside and certainly discovered from the inside, that has values, that has strong values, and it's part of their values to be a good corporate citizen, and an important part of that is obviously promoting a sustainable environment. But it also makes hugely important business sense. So Lord Deben referred to the savings that you can make from energy efficiency. Absolutely, Google saves $1 billion a year from we've saved $1 billion so far in energy costs because of becoming more efficient. We now get 3.5 times as much computing power from the same energy as we did some years ago. Our data centers, the cloud more generally, we think our data centers and our cloud is particularly energy efficient, but in general, as businesses move data to the cloud, they can get as much as 90% energy savings when they do that. So there is a huge business case just in reducing costs. Then there is the further looking business case of finding a way to develop energy, because we certainly use energy, finding a way to develop sources of energy that do not add to carbon. And we have done that, as you mentioned, by focusing on sourcing ourselves with renewables. We've been, since 2007, carbon neutral, despite the fact that computing does use a lot of energy. That is partly by buying credits and so on. We have a goal to use just renewable energy. We've a public goal to triple our use of renewable energy by 2025, consistent with the efforts. And we've signed a lot of contracts, as you referred to purchase renewable energy. And we have, as you said, from the product to the process to the CEO, made our voice known. We've signed on to the Clean Power Plan, to the amicus brief in favor of that, because, again, we believe it makes good business sense. We believe it makes America a good place to invest in. We believe it makes the world, will support this shift in the world. We've been involved in the European plans, which are complicated because there are 28 national governments, but Europe has obviously been a leader before in this area. It's important that the energy, and it was interesting that you had both Vice President Šefčovič and Commissioner Cañete, because you need both the climate and energy pieces to move together. And that's really something that's changed over the past couple of years, I think. So from a business point of view, it completely makes sense, and we're very committed to continue on that. We look for additionality when we have contracts on renewable. We look for direct purchasing to speed the use of renewables through utilities. And by the way, we're the largest non-utility user worldwide of renewable energy. So we're very proud of that. Thanks.
That's great. And as I said, I'm also fascinated by, I think it's like 3 billion people a day or something that do Google searches, and that your product itself exposes your users to these ideas as well.
Absolutely.
I think it's a very powerful platform to stand on. And I think, so that's terrific. Thank you. And you mentioned the savings that you got from energy efficiency, which of course I saw Kateri's face light up when you said that. So it's a natural segue to you. And I think energy efficiency, nobody dislikes energy efficiency. Everyone likes it. I think it's often seen as the low-hanging fruit. But is it a fruit that we've already picked? I mean, are the easy opportunities gone? How important is energy efficiency now? And I think, in the United States, but also globally, there's going to be a difference there. Can you talk to us a little bit about that and about, I know you can. Will you talk to us a little bit about that?
Thanks, Sharon. I really appreciate that. And what I'd like to do first, though, is thank Google, because Google actually has a day where they'll highlight nonprofits and their causes, and they've actually highlighted energy efficiency in the Alliance a couple of times, so they've helped us to spread the good word. So thank you for that. Let's talk about the low-hanging fruit. Everyone loves to call it that, and have we picked it all? We've certainly picked a lot, particularly here in the U.S., and I'll start with that. Over the course of the last 40 years, we've been able to double energy productivity in the U.S. What does that mean? That means we're getting twice as much GDP today for each unit of energy we consume. It's really a tremendous story, but it's not the best story around the world, even with our high levels of increased energy productivity. And I should say, studies show about 60% of that improvement is due to policy and technology, to energy efficiency. The other 40% to structural changes in our economy, but it's enormous. It's enormous. But yet it's not the greatest news story in terms of deploying energy efficiency and becoming more energy productive. And we'll talk about that in a minute because there are some better stories in other parts around the world. I think the good news, well, let's talk a minute about what that means to the United States in terms of the monies that are pumped back into our economy that aren't wasted on energy and aren't able to go to USA Inc.'s bottom line and therefore to consumers and to businesses. It also means that we've avoided emissions equivalent to about 2.5 billion tons a year, which is actually the world's emissions when they first started in Hawaii, looking at emissions of CO2 globally and measuring that. We were at, and that was back in 1958, a long time ago, we were at 2.5 billion tons a year. So very significant reductions in CO2 loadings. The question is, have we done it all then? And the answer is decidedly no. Studies show that in the US, we still waste somewhere north of 50% of the energy that we consume. And I've seen studies that go all the way up to 85, 90% of that energy is going off as waste. So there's a lot of opportunity left. So we, several years ago, took a look at, well, what would happen if we doubled energy productivity again in the United States? And we just shortened the time that it took to do it. So we used a baseline of 2011 and said, all right, we want to double energy productivity in the US again by 2030. What would that mean? And we had an independent economic analysis done on that. First of all, can you do it? Technically, are the technologies there? Study after study says, yeah, they're there, they're on the shelf, we just need to deploy them. Have the policy structure and infrastructure in place to allow us to do that. We would save $327 billion a year. $327 billion a year as economy. Well, let's take that down to a personal level. That's over $1,000 per family in savings on their utility bills every year in the US. We'd take our need for imported energy down to less than 7% of our total consumption. In our world in DC, energy independence is the holy grail. We almost get there just by making investments in energy efficiency that return more to the economy than they cost to make. And oh, by the way, let's talk about what that means to climate. We would take our emissions down to a third below where they were in 2005. So essentially getting us to the commitment that the president made in Paris. That's all, just with improving and getting the waste out of our system, not putting on new wind, not putting on new solar, just getting the waste out of the system. So there's a tremendous amount that can be done. The good news is that the EIA predicts that by 2030, we're going to improve our energy productivity by more than half, by more than 50%. And that's because of the policies and programs that are already in place. And I will say that conservatives, I would agree with you, some that are here, particularly in the city now, are ignoring the facts. But President Reagan was the first president to sign into law, and a good friend of Maggie Thatcher's, as I recall, to sign into law building energy codes and appliance and equipment standards, two of the key ways. Every president since President Reagan has worked with the Congress and on a bipartisan basis to put in place national energy efficiency policy. So we're proving it can be done because nobody doesn't like energy efficiency. Why do you want to waste things? So globally, I said we weren't the best actor. There have been some studies done by Ecofis looking at energy productivity globally, where it is, where it can go in the future. And probably not surprising to you, but some of the large economies in Europe, the UK is well ahead of us, Germany is well ahead of us, France is well ahead of us, as are a number of other countries. I think we're number 40 in the top 50 in terms of energy productivity. You got to smooth that out some because we have a very energy-intensive economy and very much a manufacturing economy still to this day. But there's wide room for improvement. The same kind of figures, and I don't want to be throwing figures out at you all and making your heads spin, but Ecofis looked at what would happen in Europe, and the savings are as tremendous as what we found in the United States. And the jobs creation, which is one statistic that I will give you, if the major economies in Europe are able to double their energy productivity by 2030, it means 6 million net new jobs, and that's by 2020. That's not even going all the way out to 2030. So it's an economic driver. It's good for business. It's good for the environment. It's a win-win-win across the board. And there are a lot of ways that we can get there. It's just really, are we willing to make the investment that's going to be required, remembering that it will return more to our economies than it costs to make, and do we have the political will to put the policy infrastructure in place?
Do we?
Well, I would say that we are getting there. I mean, certainly from, if you think about governments and leading by example, and the U.S. government's our largest single energy user, thanks in large part to the Department of Defense. There's political will to do it there, and we're saving taxpayers enormous amounts of money. And so leadership is there by example, state houses across the country, communities across the country. I think that what we're not doing is working together to look at, are we maximizing the policies, and are we taking the best that's being done at the local level and migrating that up to the state level, and then migrating it up to the national level? And are we so blind to say, and so insular in the U.S., that we don't see that there are maybe better approaches around the world? So I really do think it's a focused effort on that. I think the biggest challenge for energy efficiency, and one of the reasons that we've framed it now in energy productivity to look at the economy, is it's kind of the stepchild. It's like, it's not sexy because it's not a windmill and it's not a solar panel, and it's the little stuff. It's insulating, and it's improving the pumps and putting in new HVAC equipment. And so policymakers, businesses get it because it goes to the bottom line, but policymakers, I think, have a hard time wrapping their heads around, is this something worth the doing? And I've just told you, in terms of the first, quickest, cheapest, easiest thing to do to meet the Paris commitments that were made, it's energy efficiency. And so I think getting the attention of policymakers and making energy efficiency sexy. The president tried to do it. He went to Home Depot and looked at insulation and said, energy efficiency is sexy. I don't know that resonated with people or not. But he did say, and what did resonate?
Big run on insulation.
Yeah. He did adopt the goal of doubling energy productivity on behalf of our country. And that's really started a steamroller effect within the agencies and has caught the attention and the excitement of policymakers here at all levels of government. So that can make a difference.
And I do want to get into more the incentives and the policies and whether or not it's a zero-sum game. But first, let's turn over to sexy here, renewable energy. You brought it up.
Always
It's that great.
And Greg, I do think you're sexy.
Greg, you represent you're the premier renewable energy association in the country. And I think you have some slides to share with us, but I think it'd be very helpful for us to know what the health of that industry is in this country, and give us some words about renewable energy in the United States and globally, because I think you do both.
Well, the health is excellent. We saw a company go bankrupt that got some press, but I think that's more.
Solyndra, if anybody's wondering what it's talking about.
Story.
Right.
Edison.
Sun Edison.
That too. Okay.
Right. Yeah. But I think poor business decisions have a cost, no matter
Sure.
what sector you're in. There were
Right, Lord
$44 billion invested in the last year in the U.S. renewable sector, and $286 billion invested last year globally in the renewable energy sector, and that's a big number. But what really matters, and I have a couple of slides, and I should say my colleagues up here, they made fun of me for having slides, so I got to do well with this.
Coming from the Pentagon, it would be far be it for me to make fun of slides.
Sometimes a picture is worth several words. The cost of wind and solar power in particular is dropping precipitously, and what it means, it reinforces the points that have already been made, that it is good business, good economic sense to shift to renewables, and that's why it's happening. And I don't know if you can read this graph very well from where you are. Maybe the bar chart on the bottom is most easily deciphered from a distance. But the 10 states that have the most renewable energy have the cheapest electric power. The 10 states that have the least renewable energy have the most expensive power, and the national average is in the middle. I mean, the reality is it is cheaper to shift to renewable energy even today when natural gas prices are at record lows. Even today, it's still cheaper to go to renewable energy where you do have substantial capital costs, but the fuel obviously is free, and that's very positive. We're creating a ton of jobs in the renewable sector. So nationally, 274,000 jobs. This is several times the number of jobs in the coal sector. So the notion that, well, we can't go to clean energy because we're trying to protect jobs. Clean energy is where the jobs are. And one thing that's happening that is particularly an important trend recently and a little bit of a surprise is that electricity consumers are choosing renewable energy. They're stepping up and saying, that's what we want. And that may translate as, I want to pay more from this service from my electricity provider. It may translate as, I want solar panels on my roof, which is a growing trend in this country. It's a huge share of the electricity market. As a nation, our electricity consumption is not growing, and one important reason is that more and more people are putting solar panels on their roofs, and now there are some battles in states over the policies that provide compensation for that. But the other phenomenon, which is also a very recent phenomenon and extremely important, is that major corporations like Google are going out on their own and procuring their own renewable energy. They are playing the kind of role that electric utilities used to play, where they go out and actually negotiate a contract or even finance a wind farm or a solar energy facility and buy that power. And in the process, they're meeting sustainability goals, and they're also saving money. And I do want to give a big tip of the hat to Google, who I'm proud to say is a member of ACOR, but I'm also proud to say they have lapped the field in this area. They have purchased more than twice as much renewable energy as any other company, and other companies have done a lot. So if you look down this list, on the list, and it's significant that they're there, even though they're third, is the Department of Defense, which scoots in there right below Amazon. And this is all very recent. So big thanks, Sharon, for your role there. ACOR is actively involved in working with the Navy to help facilitate procurement. It's a very different kind of thing for the armed services to be involved in negotiations with private sector energy providers and financiers. It's a kind of a different world. The Navy in particular has shown a lot of leadership in this area, but the other armed services are getting there. A lot of good reasons for that. Obviously, independence, energy independence is an important national security driver. But more than that, when you think that you can eliminate the supply lines in forward operations and military bases by having renewable energy as your energy source, you're saving a lot of juice. And the Department of Defense is all over this. They're looking very closely at it. They're also looking at EVs and their potential, which, as you might imagine, you don't have to to deal with transportation of fuels. It's just a huge, huge plus. So, stepping back, we see a lot of growth. And you say, well, this is all, for those who say, well, that's because we have policies in the U.S. that are supportive. So we do have a tax credit. It's been critically important. It was extended in 2015, right at the end of the year, for wind and solar power. All the other forms of renewable energy are still waiting for their extension. Many of them expire at the end of this year. Some of them, like fuel cells, had actually already effectively expired. So it's a serious problem. Even for wind and solar, these extensions included a phase out. So that's our policy in this country. For wind, it begins to phase down pretty dramatically starting next year. Solar has 3 or 4 more years, but then theirs starts going down as well. And if you look, where are we big picture, the amount of subsidies for renewable energy is dwarfed by the historic subsidies provided over time, the incentives for other form. We've always made power in this country, electric power, a government policy driven sector, and you see it in these numbers. And the reality is, if you fast forward a few years and we don't change policies, all of the subsidies currently for other forms of technology that generate electricity and use fossil fuels continue to remain in force, but the incentives for renewable energy are going to phase out. So obviously that is not where we need to go. This is all what economists might frame as an externality. So the industry is doing great, but we don't really have the policies in place to secure the kind of growth we need to get us where we need to be from climate. And the ability of companies like Google to step up is real value added, because those are gains beyond the Clean Power Plan, beyond any state RPS, and that's really important. But we need more in the way of a rational structure to price carbon, and which would also help in the energy efficiency world if we're really going to get where we need to be.
Well, let's talk more about that. And Lord Deben, I was curious that you were nodding. Again, you've identified yourself as the voice of a true conservative, and you're nodding, yes, we need more subsidies.
No, I'm not. I'm merely saying that, first of all, we ought to have a proper price. Right. And why I think that some people who call themselves conservatives are false conservatives, because they're not defending the free market. They're defending the market that goes on at the moment, in which most of them have got a very nice little corner, thank you very much, because the present so-called free market is actually very clearly twisted, because the real costs are not placed upon business. So the real cost, for example, of this bottle ought to include the cost of getting rid of it and recycling it and all the rest, because that's the cost. So instead of doing that, we do what the Victorians did, which was you take the profit in this generation and then leave the mess behind for the next generation to pay for. And that's because you've rigged the market. And if you look at the energy market today, it's rigged because you don't pay the cost of the carbon. So until you pay the cost of the damage that the energy is doing, you're not paying the proper price. What you're doing is making other people pay the price. And the very people who defend that are the people who don't ever allow the community to pay for anything. So what they're doing is making private industry not charge the customer the proper price, and then leaving the cost of the clear up, whether it's in climate or pollution or whatever it else, to the community. The very area where those same politicians say we shouldn't be spending this money, we want lower taxes, we don't want big government, the rest of it. Unless the consumer pays the proper price, you inevitably have big government. That's the fact of life. If the consumer pays the proper price, then the things you need to be to have done are done by business, because they have charged the price and provided the resources. Now, the pictures you put up is exactly. We have a system in which all around the world we subsidise fossil fuels. But we never mention that when we talk about the so-called subsidies of renewables. there's less subsidies for renewables, and what there is trying to give them some kind of equality with the already subsidised fossil fuels. If we put the right price on the fossil fuels, you wouldn't need any help for the renewables because they wouldn't be polluting the atmosphere, wouldn't have to pay, therefore, for the clean-up, and the real price, the market, the thing that Conservatives believe in, would actually do what it's supposed to do, which is to ensure that you make the use of resources as sensible as possible. So I'm shaking my head in agreement, not with subsidies, but with removing subsidies and giving people the proper price. Once you give them the proper price, then in fact you will get the result that you want. And there are so many things you can do. I mean, as I listened to you speaking, for example, I wanted to say, when you come from Europe like I do, and you go into an American hotel room, they are intolerable. They are so cold. So then you try to do something about it. And they've invented a system for air conditioning which is designed for people not to be able to use. I don't know how they've done it, but it is impossible.
Right.
And then you find you've got, of course, a refrigerator in the hotel room. The refrigerator is hardly ever opened, but it's run like in most hotels, not the ones we advise in Sandcroft. Sandcroft's got that. We've saved hotels huge amounts of money simply by having refrigerators that don't work at the same speed as the domestic refrigerator, because they don't need to. Because where the cost is when you open the door constantly, as we all do at home. Don't do that.
Or Deben, we should start together a campaign. If we would just simply do what they do so effectively in Europe and have a key card that turns off everything when you come in and out. Why doesn't everyone? Nothing is more infuriating than walking into a hotel room and everything's on. The TV, the music, everything.
They think it's welcoming. Actually, it's insulting. Because, well, it means your bill is bigger than it ought to be because you've paid for all that noise and that. But just if I may be naughty again about the hotel, but you go in and there's a little notice which says, "We're helping the environment," it says. And there's no sign whatsoever except that they suggest that if you don't mind using your towels twice, you can do so. And you say, well, that's all very well. You're making money out of the fact that you don't have to wash my towels. So none of them do, unless they've been advised by us.
We're not opposed to making
which we're
money.
Not opposed to, but not making it while pretending you're helping the environment when the music is still on and the lights are all on. But what we do, or this is in Sandcroft, we've always made sure that they say, and all the money that we save goes to improve our environmental performance, or it goes to WWF, or it goes so that you do not allow people to see these measures as merely another mechanism for people to make money. What you want them to be seen is a proper statement about the real costs and how you can make those costs change the world we live in. And that's why I don't like the word subsidy. Because I want to get rid of subsidies and have proper price.
But I think that we've got, you're absolutely right, of course, about the amount of money that is spent on subsidising fossil fuels. I think I know there has been a strong campaign internationally to focus governments on that fact, and on the fact that particularly people say, well, we need to have subsidies in some poorer countries because poor people need to be able to use the buses, or they need to be able to get fuel that's cheaper. But actually, of course, if you have untargeted subsidies of fuel, those help the largest energy consumers, the people that are lucky enough to have their own car or their own large cars, lucky enough to have air conditioning in a hot climate. So there's been a lot of advice, and even the international institutions like the IMF, the World Bank, increasingly look to things like supporting targeting of subsidies, so they actually go to the users that need them. And a country like India has also taken steps in that direction. Indonesia has. So I think that there is it's like turning some massive tanker, but I believe that there is increasing movement to do that globally. Interestingly enough, what's been happening in Saudi Arabia is in a way doing that, because they were a major subsidizer. But I think we can, even the American hotels, I think, can move towards having more efficient, the key cars that switch off the electricity or other ways of saving money. And again, it comes back to what you were saying at the beginning. For why should a hotel be spending money on a refrigerator that would be fine at home if it can reduce costs by a more efficient one? Unfortunately, it's very sensitive politically, especially perhaps in the United States, to talk about carbon pricing. But in practice, a lot of the regulations you were speaking about, the energy, the building codes, the vehicle codes, are another way of guiding behavior, even though they're more intrusive and they're not as clean and conservative with a small c. And Lord Deben's absolutely right on that. But they are another way that you can direct and find a way of showing the cost. I think we all have a lot to learn
I'd
from
like
Europe.
to hear from Greg and Kateri about what kinds of policies specifically you think you need to see. And also I'm going to challenge both of you. Tell us what you think governments need to do for your businesses that you represent. And then can you tell us why they don't cancel each other out? Why what you need and what you need aren't a zero-sum game?
Want to start with me?
Sure.
Okay, the less sexy one, right? I want to mention.
Don't make me contradict that openly. It would be interesting.
I want to mention.
I'm happy to.
I want to mention. I think because I want to be cognizant of the time. Let's talk about
we do
three different policies, two of which have just been mentioned. Building energy codes are key. The buildings that we build are often going to last 100 years. There's no reason not to build them efficiently, whether you're talking about commercial buildings or you're talking about residential buildings. And that's something we've done very effectively in the United States. And in the last two code cycles, we've actually made about a 38% improvement in energy efficiency. There's still more that can be done, but we're having a really difficult time in this country continuing to move forward because we're having to fight against the home builders who don't want to see improvements in building energy codes and fight that because of the additional upfront costs. And I think they don't look at the facts. They don't look at how much a person buying a home or buying a building is going to save immediately on their energy bills and over the course of the life of the building. They simply ignore that. So that's one. The second is appliance and equipment standards. And I don't see those as intrusive, especially after 13 years of watching how they develop and how industry works with the stakeholders and works with the government to come up. So right now in the U.S., we're covering 90% of your products in your home have an efficiency standard. About 60% of commercial building products are covered, and only about 30% of industry products. So there's more products to cover, and we constantly need updates as the technology changes. Those are very specific. They haven't been controversial in the past. They've become the LAMP standards that went in effect in 2007 became the poster child for the uber conservatives of the government's gone too far. They're coming in and they're taking away your light bulbs. It's okay for the government, I guess, if you're conservatives go into the bedroom, but not into the thing. So, but what we've seen is there's an explosion of light bulb technology. I mean, it's mind-boggling to go in a store now, and the prices have fallen precipitously. So those two. To go on the other side of incentives and removing those, but go to pricing carbon. We have a program in the Northeast states, 9 states, called RGGI, the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. It's been in place since 2009. Studies that looked at what's come out of putting a cap and therefore creating revenues that are auctioned for the CO2 credits there. There's a study that looked at what happened in those 9 states between 2012 and 2014. Prices didn't go up on utility bills. They actually went down because investments were made through those auctions in energy efficiency and in lower carbon source. And it generated a net economic gain of $1.3 billion in those 9 states, $30 a person of net economic gain by effectively putting a price on carbon, putting a cap and trade program in place. We need to price carbon in this country, and that's something that, the Alliance to Save Energy, we've got 130 businesses who support us, and the work that we do, many of those have called for pricing on carbon. There are a lot of different ways and structures. We're agnostic as to how you do it, but prices matter. If you want to control energy use, if you want to get rid of the waste, price energy appropriately.
Do you agree with that, Greg? You think it's possible?
Absolutely possible and necessary. And I think Lord Deben's point is critical. There's two kinds of subsidies. I mean, one is the money that the federal government is actually paying to promote use of fossil fuels, which makes absolutely zero sense. But the other is the more subtle subsidy that we're providing in the cost we all experience as a result of the carbon emissions that are external to this whole system. So we do need carbon pricing, and it's an approach that would provide an appropriate incentive for the hotel owners, among others. It would incentivize both energy efficiency and renewable energy versus fossil sources. So we need some kind of major national policy like that. Cap and trade is another way to get there. There have been other approaches, but the most elegant and economically efficient is carbon pricing. There are some other really key policies. We were talking about what Google and other corporations are doing to buy renewable energy. There's actually a lot of obstacles today to companies trying to do that, depending what state you're in. Some states don't allow companies to procure their own energy, and they have to go through all kinds of basically jump through hoops to make that happen. But
is there sufficient will to change in the fact that Google will not locate a data center in their state if they
absolutely can? Google and Amazon, to their credit, are actively making that case, and ACOR, our organization, has been going to states, meeting with state leaders, and bringing with us renewable energy investors, and these are big multinational banks and renewable developers and companies like Amazon and Google who are prepared to say, we will expand to your state or expand our existing facility or consider expanding only if we are able to get renewable energy that's generated here in the state for our facilities. So that makes a big difference.
So it's removing the obstacles, not just
It's removing the obstacles,
right, okay.
and we're seeing headway, but a lot of other corporations are in this game too now. More than 150 signed the White House pledge to do more to reduce their carbon emissions, and they don't all have that same kind of economic leverage.
Right.
So, we have to carry this lesson to states that if you want to grow economically, just where in the old days, the industrial facilities would site along the river. And now we're reaching a point where they're going where the wind power is and the solar power is. And that means you have to have a workable grid. You have to have transmission. You have to have friendly policies that allow that. So that's part of the picture. And, we're on a very good trajectory now, but the trajectory we need to be on to reach the commitments that we made in Paris, as we're all very aware, but just to put it out there again, is a much steeper curve. We've got to grow faster and be more effective in driving the transition to a renewable energy economy, and that's where we want to be.
A great point, and actually I'm going to preset my closing question for all of you based on what Greg just said, so give you time to think about it and give the audience time to ask questions, which is, we've been making a business case, but it's been somewhat incremental. Can you make a business case for transformational change is a question I have for each of you. But think about that for a minute, and before we get there, audience, if you have questions or comments for our panel, now is your chance. So if you'll raise your hand and identify yourself. We have one right there. We go.
Sabina O'Hara, Dean of the College of Agriculture, Urban Sustainability and Environmental Sciences of the University of the District of Columbia. We are the only urban land grant university in the country. Thank you for your wonderful comments. But my question is this. It certainly is a great step in the right direction to internalize negative externalities, and to do so preferably through a price-based rather than a regulation-based approach. But is that enough? I want to really challenge us to think more about how we build economies that work more like nature does, that close loops, that look not just at sources, and reducing sources is certainly a step in the right direction, but how about an economy that knows how the sinks work and how we reduce pressure on sinks? Because I think we're running out of sinks much faster than we're running out of sources. And I want to invite all of you here to the International Society of Ecological Economics conference that we're hosting June 26 to 29 on our campus. Thank you.
Thank you. And I think the term of the day is the circular economy. It used to be sustainability.
Well, I think that's I was for many years Minister of Agriculture in Britain, so I'm very much in sympathy with this concept. But I tell you that those of you who've read the Pope's encyclical Laudato Si will notice that he makes a very important change in the way of thinking about these things, because he talks about climate change not as a kind of end, but as a symptom of the way that human beings have treated the earth. And not in a kind of wet and silly way, but a really tough way, that we have treated the earth as if it's something that you can rape constantly without any kind of concern, and that all the other things that we all are concerned about are connected with that, whether it's poverty, whether it's pollution of other kinds, and that it's much better, therefore, to think much more seriously about the relationship of human beings with the earth, not in a kind of Gaiaist, Mother Earth sort of thing, but to accept the fundamental fact that we've got one planet that we have to live on with all the other people, and that we must do it in a way which enables it to continue to give us life. And therefore, understanding the rhythms of the earth, the way in which the earth itself operates, seems to me so obvious, but it is in fact the contrary to what we have done for so long. And you reminded me of it when you were talking about energy efficiency and there being a lot of little things. Politicians are very bad at that, because what they want are big things they can point at, boys' toys. This is why they like nuclear power energy. I'm not opposed to it, but they just love that because it's a big thing you can point at and say, I did that. Whereas saving energy by the simple, smaller things are not very easy. It's not a question so much about being sexy. It's just a question about kind of knowing how you attribute the value of doing it.
There's no ribbon cutting ceremony.
There's no ribbon cutting, absolutely. And so I think the same is true about trying to see how the world, how the earth works. And if you go right back to Aristotle, and he writes this wonderful piece about the dung beetle, this miserable, horrible, ugly beetle, which nobody takes any notice at all, but is absolutely crucial because it feeds on dung and turns dung into healthy soil. And it's a symbol of his whole concept of the way in which the world should be thought. Whereas if you think about the world we've got, it's about throwing stuff away. And as a friend of mine said, there's no such place as a way. And that's how we think of all this. So I'm deeply a believer, and I think human beings are going to become more and more aware of it. I think we're so lucky to be living at this moment, because this is the biggest change in human understanding of the world since the Renaissance. So instead of all those boring centuries in between, we're there just when it's really happening. Very frightening.
Yes, but very interesting. I just want to say that it's true. I completely agree with you that we need ribbon-cutting ceremonies and what we used to call in government deliverables. But I will say that buried in the text of communiques of G20, the countries that account for 80% of global output, and the G7, were commitments on things that may seem as sort of low profile as waste, the distribution, cleaning up oceans, a lot of, so pushing research about how, where does all the plastic come from that is in the seas? How dangerous is it? How do you stop that upstream or on land, and so on, is really important.
Do you think we can take that systems level view, though, and actually execute it, turn it into deliverables?
Yeah, I think we can, but I think that in the end, you need to have the people promoting, you need to have a lot of smaller decisions. That's why prices can be important, but technology is also important. And you asked this question about can we be transformational? Google is in the business of being transformational, which is actually a better term than the one that people often use, which is just disruption. But we're in the business of making transformational changes, and I think that even in energy efficiency, you can see that connecting technology so that you know what you're doing when you're doing it, and you're given an indication of how your building is operating, or Google's Street View cars can tell people about what's happening to the climate and air pollution in that area. So we're getting much more, it's almost like biofeedback that was kind of fashionable in medical language. We're getting more of an earth feedback ability through technology now, and I think that will be a powerful driver for more change.
I just wonder if it can happen quickly enough. So I see the thinking changing. We have an initiative. We're going to roll out a report actually next week called it's called The Sum is Greater Than the Parts, but it's on systems efficiency. And we took a look. We had to cut it somewhere to start. So we took a look at a commercial building, multi-residential and commercial use buildings, and said, if you start looking at it as a system rather than the components, a lighting system rather than a light bulb, can you drive greater efficiencies and more cost effective? And what does it take in changing, and who has to be talking to each other, the designer and the builder and the energy manager? And it quickly, we have 50 people. It's just fascinating from all over the buildings discipline working on this. And it quickly, they got to yes, and here's all the things that need to happen. But then you can't stop at the building. You have to think about the way the building connects to the grid, and you have to think about a system as a community. So I think that thinking is starting, and it is because we have enabling technology that's allowing us to do it. The question is, can we get to where you want to be and bring enough people on fast enough? Because we still have people, we had people fighting us that didn't even want to really go out and talk about this from some of the environmental community, because they think, well, maybe that means that people can take this and use it and say we shouldn't do efficiency standards on components anymore. So they're scared of kind of the pushback on it. So I think it's just, can it happen fast enough?
I think we have a couple of other questions. Sir?
Thank you. Anthony Soria from the European Commission. You've been discussing the opportunities of climate change mitigation policy in terms of job creation. To some extent, this is associated only to emerging industries like the renewable technology, on opposition to sectors that will be penalized. But there is another reflection to make, which is the opportunity that this offers to rationalize the taxation system, in the sense that the revenues coming from climate policy may be used to remove distortions in the labor market that are now penalizing the job creation. What is your feeling about this?
I mean, my reaction is that if you find more sensible ways to operate price, I think this is what you're getting at, for sure, different countries can make political choices about how they want to spend the additional revenues, whether they want to have a revenue neutral shift in subsidies, for example, or whether they want to favor some other support, reducing payroll taxes or something else. I think that's a political decision that can be taken within a country. The important sort of understanding is this one that I spoke about at the beginning, which is seeing addressing climate change and focusing on renewables as something that makes business and economic sense for individual businesses such as ours, but also for economies more broadly. This is something about how to grow in the future, and that's the kind of positive story, and individual countries can decide how they want to make those political choices about which things they want to address with any additional revenues. I just want to say one thing about...
I'm sorry, do you want to continue?
No, I was just going to say about, we talked a lot about the United States, but about Europe, obviously, you mentioned how tremendously Europe has led on energy, and you also mentioned there's so much more built into the culture of energy efficiency, and not just the culture, but the way that the markets work there, and very impressive. It's also, the next wave, I think, in Europe needs to be about facilitating, in a way, the use of technology, but also the use of this base to make it much easier to have a regional energy market, to support the kinds of policies that will allow countries to build on each other's successes rather than have, and that's an important effort, and I'm sure people talked about it this morning, that European policymakers are taking on.
Yeah, I was just going to mention that here in the U.S., ultimately, if we have carbon pricing, it's going to be because we are able to construct effectively a sufficiently strong political coalition, and part of that may be what happens to the proceeds, which there have been proposals, huge dent in the national debt. You could help disruptive communities. You could provide assistance to promote the right kind of technologies we're going to need to get where we need to be. So it does create a lot of opportunities to have some form of carbon pricing, and then you have funds to deal with, as they do, for example, now in California. I know there's a huge fund that is spent partly in clean energy, but in other ways too.
Time for one more question. She's coming.
Hi, my name is Mihaela Karste. I'm with the Energy Policy Group, think tank based in Eastern Europe. Thank you so much for your comments about the hotel and the differences. And the reason I'm bringing those up is because my question has to do with the societal and cultural shift that has to occur in order to get those politicians that would rather have a photo op or a ribbon cutting ceremony to support less sexy projects such as energy efficiency. How do you see the role of businesses, innovative businesses such as Google, working with governments and policymakers to help move forward that social and cultural shift that needs to happen? Thank you.
I think if each of you would answer in turn, we'll make that the closing thought. And if you feel so inclined to also talk about whether there's a business case for transformational change, certainly I think it's an excellent question. And I think Google's not waiting for someone to tell them to find the answer, nor is Apple. I think Greenpeace did a scorecard, a sort of report card for businesses on this, and Apple got straight A's, and Facebook was an A student. Google got B's as a B student, but I think clearly rising in the ranks.
Thank you. Homework now.
But I think the point being that these companies, I think, are not waiting to be told to do it. They're driving the change, which is really interesting. But so let's go through the panel and make this a closing comment, both about that and transformational change.
Well, I think the transformation has begun, and I think what we see now, where you're actually saving money when you make that transition. We're at a place right now where large coal-fired power plants in many cases are being considered stranded assets, and folks are figuring out how do you deal with that. The question is really the rate of transformation. I think there's a strong business case for an adequate rate of transformation to address the problem. Ultimately, we care about the ecosystems and what's happening there, but ultimately it's self-interest, and it's really a question of planning horizon. So if we look, not next quarter, not next year, but even 5 or 10 years, it's a very different world. And I will say that this is all happening much more rapidly than was projected. And I was following these issues in 1990, and the kind of changes that we are seeing today that are already happening right now in the real world were projected in the realm of 2050, 2075. So, your comments about respect for facts, respect for the scientific method and science, I think is really critical. And if business respects fact and business respects science, and I believe it does, the rational course is to invest in a way that is going to be consistent with the long-term health of the business and our economy, not to mention our planet.
Lord Deben, let's come to you for the last word and let Kateri go next.
Great, thanks. I'll make this very brief. I do believe transformation can happen and in some ways is already upon us. And I think that there's not a secret formula. I think we've seen it. We've talked a lot about Google, but we have a representative or did of JCI sitting here. What companies are doing is adopting big, hairy, audacious goals. Not sure how they're going to get there in terms of whether it's energy intensity or energy productivity or carbon intensity. And then they're finding the ways to do it because they've set that agenda. I think we need to do that globally. I think Paris was a good start. It's necessary, but probably not sufficient. So what I would encourage is for governments to work with businesses to see how they set these big targets. We as the Alliance would say one of your targets, or maybe the first target, is doubling energy productivity. And why do you do that? If we could get a global race, just think about that. Economies getting stronger, more resilient, building jobs, and getting really clean, all while making money. To me, that's the way we have a transformation that can occur. And we've got the strategies. We've got people who have done it. We've done it already once ourselves, as have many countries. I think we can do it, and I think we can do it quickly.
So I'm afraid we're out of time, but if you have a quick last word, Caroline, Lord Deben?
Well, it is going well. Who would have thought 20 years ago when we first started to work with Coca-Cola, for example, that 20 years later they would be putting back every drop of water they take out? Who would have thought they'd have signed up to the President's initiative? Who would have thought that? It's all very much better. But don't kid yourself. We have to do it faster. There is an urgency which we haven't got hold of, and there are some very nasty people out there who are determined to stop us. It's only today that I see that Volkswagen, that great responsible company, Volkswagen has joined with Shell to try to hold up the movement towards electric vehicles because they think that it would be better to do it through bioenergy. Load of nonsense. The fact is, and I have a Twitter feed on @Lord Deben. You want to come and see?
You're renowned for that.
Yes,
so do
Lord
look him
Deben.
up.
You want anybody like to join, because there are a lot of trolls out there, and you see those people who are determined to stop us. So yes, we're well on the way. Don't be despondent. We should be optimistic, but urgency is really the name of the game.
I agree with that, and I think high tech can really help.
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.